Right. So I've been given the honor to start this, give an introduction to Kashrut. So this shiur and the following two shiurim will be with me. It's interesting. I always seem to be given the honor of starting off a new subject. So the word of Kashrut is actually very, very appropriate because we just yesterday read Parashat Shmini. Does anybody know what is then Parashat Shmini? That's very practical. What did we read about yesterday in the Torah?
Kosher and non-kosher birds, for instance, or animals in general.
Very, very good. Thank you. Right? So we actually have a very, very big percentage of the laws of Kashrut were in yesterday's parasha. So before we go into sources and try to understand the actual practical laws, maybe just spend a little bit of time on the understanding of the why, so to say. And to tell you the truth, Kashrut is an area of halacha like any other. It's an area, it's the mitzvot of the Torah, which, as we know, they're commandments from God, and we don't know the reason for them, right? They're in the category of what we call chukim, rules which we have to accept without rationalizations of why. Now, there's a very, very fruitful literature of Ta'amei mitzvot, of trying to understand the reasons for the mitzvot. And if you followed last year in the Nordic Bet Midrash on Wednesday nights, if they went through lots of different mitzvot and their reasons, and possibly, I don't remember if we covered Kashrut as well, there's plenty of discussion in our sources. Some say it has to do with health, and others say it's got to do with the kosher animals having bad characteristics, and the third opinion will say it's got to do with how the way we do the shchita is more humane, and there are lots of different ideas, mystical ideas in the Kabbalah about how the kosher animals are on such a level of so distant from the non-kosher animals, so distant from God's holiness that you can't through eating you can't achieve the same tikkunim, the reparation of the spiritual side of them as you could with kosher animals. There are all sorts of, if you want, philosophical and spiritual explanations of kashrut. But when we're learning halacha, these don't really come into the picture at all, because at the end of the day, this is God's law. You know that He knows better than you, and therefore we accept His mitzvot. And it's very important that we approach things with this perspective, quite similar than when we learn Hilchot Shabbat. If you remember, you learned to spend the whole winter understand going through the melachot of Shabbat. There was no discussion, about, well, why can't I do this? Why can't I do that? Sometimes the things which are forbidden on Shabbat might not be so tiring at all, but they're still forbidden. So the same thing when we approach the laws of Kashrut, we have to understand that this is the system how it works. So a lot of it is written mefurash in the Torah, it's actually written letter for letter. Sometimes deeper elaboration is in the oral Torah, in the oral tradition, and not written clearly in the written Torah, but all the same, it's all the Torah, and it's all from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We will have a few rabbinic enactments to protect the Torah, that we'll find, and we'll discuss them in due time. So now, I'm going to start. I don't want to go running all around the Torah to show you different places. I think what I'm going to show you now. Wait a second. This is not here. Wait a second. Let's get the right place. Here. No, here. Good. And now I will share a screen with you. Okay. So what we have here is a piece from the Mishneh Torah. Does anybody happen to know what is the Mishneh Torah? Anybody ever heard of the Mishneh Torah? Okay, it's fine if you haven't. Just nice general knowledge, nothing more than that. Nothing is. Oh, Justin, somebody here. Yeah, please.
Yeah, that's the work of Maimonides.
Exactly. Very good. The Mishneh Torah is the most famous set of books of the Rambam, of Moshe ben Maimon, also known as Maimonides, as you said in secular academics. And he wrote 14 books, which cover the whole Torah, the whole Talmud, in a very systematic way. And that's why when you start a subject, a new subject is very useful because it allows you to, you know where to look. When you study Torah, there might be a very important verse in the Torah here, and another verse, very important, a completely different part of the Torah. Come the Talmud, it's even worse. You have a whole tractate discussing Kashrut, but then some super important law in Kashrut might be in a different tractate altogether, in the laws of Pesach or something. So you're not going to find all the necessary information in one place. The Rambam, he went through the Talmud, he collected all the information, and you can find things in a very nice and orderly fashion. So I thought when we're now learning about Kashrut, we should learn in this way that we understand the theoretical basis very, very well as possible, and then we move on to the practical. And then when we come to the practical things, a lot of the theoretical things will come to life, and you understand why we're doing things. Some people like to go straight to the practice, but then you don't know why you're doing it, what the reason is, and then you end up confused because you're learning the reason as you're getting along. If you look at the Rambam, we'll actually see what the laws are. So, in his chapter, we're not going to learn the whole chapter together. That's much too complicated. I want to just see the first lines of the chapter of these laws of forbidden food, Hilchot Machanot Asurot. And there he puts the mitzvot. What mitzvot are there? Yeah, Rambam famously enumerated the 613 mitzvot, and he says that 28 of them are related to forbidden food. Let's take a look at what we have here. So first we have 4 positive mitzvot. Check the signs between a kosher and a non-kosher animal. If people follow the parasha, can anybody tell me how do you know what an animal is kosher or not? Who wants to tell me the signs of a kosher animal? Please.
Where animal's hoof is divided and cud. It is
very good. So kosher land animals, they chew their cud and they have a split hoof. That's written in the Torah. Very good. Then birds are actually interesting. What did the Torah say about birds yesterday? Did anybody follow?
Esimerkiksi haaskalinnut eivät ole kosherlintuja.
Haaska, okay. So this was in Finnish, not everybody understands.
Kuolleita eläinraatoja.
Okay, not everybody understands Finnish here, but yeah, you were talking about like maybe animals that eat bodies or something. Actually, the Torah does not give clear signs of a kosher animal and of a kosher bird, sorry. And the Torah just leaves you a list of non-kosher birds, and all other birds are kosher. However, we don't know how to translate these words. They're very difficult Hebrew words. A lot of them are complicated. So therefore, when it comes to bird, we actually only eat birds where we have a tradition of eating them. That Jews have always eaten them, so we know they are kosher, right? So I think the most famous one, what the Jews like to eat, Friday night, for example, was the most famous kosher bird, the most used, most common Jewish stereotypical food.
Chicken.
Chicken, right? So chicken, we know Jews have always eaten chicken. Duck, also geese, they will be very popular, not so popular nowadays, but they were very popular in Eastern Europe. In the Torah, we found quails. The Jews ate quails in the desert, and we find that they would bring a pigeon or a dove as a sacrifice, a temple, and they were eaten by the Kohanim. So we know that these things are kosher. Well, otherwise, we don't really eat birds. Turkey, it's interesting, was a huge argument in its time when the first turkeys were brought from America. A huge argument: are turkeys kosher or not? In the first, when they first came, but eventually it was accepted by basically almost all the Jews in the world that turkey is a kosher animal. It's become a very popular Jewish food. Basically, the idea is, even though Jews obviously didn't have a tradition that turkey was kosher because there were no turkeys in Israel in the times of the Tanakh, it was taken on that turkeys are very, very similar to chicken. They're the same family. Therefore they should be considered kosher birds. There are some Jews who don't, but basically all Jews around the world have accepted the turkey as a kosher animal, as a kosher bird. There are some signs given in the Talmud to give a bit of idea what sort of birds are kosher, but practically speaking, we don't really rely on any of those signs. We just eat the birds that Jews have always eaten. Okay, then we have a non-kosher locust from a kosher one. This I don't think is very practical for any of us. I don't know if any of you like to eat locusts anyway. But actually, there are some interesting insects are usually all non-kosher. There are certain locusts which are kosher. And again, we don't really have a clear tradition. Yemenite Jews, some of them have a tradition of certain locusts they actually kept eating over the centuries, and some of them I think they still eat them. But you would have to be very careful because you'd have to know which ones actually are. And the locusts are very similar. Some of them are kosher, others aren't. And then we have fish. Fish was again very clearly written in the Torah. Does anybody remember? How do you know fish is kosher?
It should have fins and scales.
Excellent. Fins and scales. And actually, I'll tell you a little trick that the Talmud already tells us that every fish that has scales also has fins. It doesn't work the other way around. If it has fins, doesn't mean it has scales. But if it's got scales, it definitely has fins. So therefore, if you see a fish with scale, you can eat it, no problem. Okay, so that's that. And then we have a few other things. All of these are from the Torah. These are all mitzvot from the Torah, which are written in the verses of the Torah. So obviously you can't eat the animals which are not kosher, birds, fish, insects, creeping, worms, whatever the animals are. So this is all very clear. All the animals are in the Torah. We read yesterday in the Torah. I see a chat, there's a question. Okay, it was written already. Okay, doesn't matter. Okay, so everything that's in the Torah. And so if you read yesterday's parasha, that would be good. I would very strongly, I think everybody should always try to study the week's parasha. It's very important. First of all, it's a mitzvah really to study the parasha. It should be read as a mitzvah of Shnai Mikra, of twice in Hebrew and once in translation. And you should listen to the Torah in the shul. But also, this is everything else is based on the Torah. So if you keep reviewing it all the time, the parasha, then you'll be able to learn deeper things. If you don't have the Torah in your head, you're not going to be able to. So this text, just if people want to take exact notes, in the Torah you will find the list of kosher and non-kosher animals in Leviticus chapter 11. Yeah? Vayikra chapter 11. That is where you'll find this list, and we read it yesterday in the Torah, Parashat Shmini. Then we have an interesting halacha called nevela. In the Torah, you shall not eat any nevela. Now, what is nevela? Nevela means an animal that died without ritual slaughter, that wasn't shechted, whom was never made shchita. Right? So now this is very, very important, especially, I'm saying this because very often among, shall we say, traditional Jews or Jews who are not religious but keep some traditions, they often think that I'm a good Jew because I don't eat pork. You know, that's a common sentence. But actually, it's not correct at all. Obviously, there are many animals besides pork that are forbidden, as all of us know. But besides that, any kosher animal, a cow, a sheep, anything like that, if it has not been slaughtered according to the halakha, by a shochet, an expert Jewish slaughterer, then it is not kasher. It's just the same as eating pork or eating shrimps. It prohibition from the Torah to eat nevela. The Torah says you shall slaughter the way I have instructed you. And this is actually one of the big proofs of the oral Torah. Yeah, there were certain groups, the Karaites or so on, who did not believe in the oral Torah. But this is one of the proofs against them. The Torah says you shall slaughter the way I have said, and nowhere in the Torah are the instructions how to slaughter. All of that was passed on orally from teacher to student over the centuries. And the Talmud records the exact rule of slaughter, hilchot shchita, and this is how they train the shochatim till this day today, very specific rules of shchita, which have to be done correctly in the right way. And if this wasn't done, if the animal was died in any other way, then the animal is not kasher. Okay, then there are a few cases of things you're not allowed to eat, which are not so common. An ox that was stoned to death. There is a halacha in the Torah, a very violent animal that killed a person, we get stoned. You shouldn't be allowed to eat it. Okay, not very practical. We don't have a Beit HaMikdash, we don't have these penalties today. Not to partake of an animal with a mortal wound. This is the famous thing called trefa. By the way, this is a good time to clarify a bit of terminology, because there is what the words mean and how they are used, right? So colloquially, in everyday language, Jews tend to say something is kosher and something is treif, right? Neither of these are very correct, to be precise. Kasher or kosher in Ashkenazi, kosher or kasher in Sephardic Hebrew, actually means correct or okay, all right, yeah? It doesn't have to even mean food, yeah? You could have a kosher mezuzah, a kosher Torah scroll, yeah? You could have kosher speech or kosher business. It just means everything is done correctly, according to as it should be done. However, it became very popular to use kashrut for centuries already as a word for the food being okay, being kasher, right? And from there comes the expression also to say that something that's non-kosher, we call it treif. It's a bit Yiddish, it comes from Hebrew, trefa, taref. Actually, what does treif or taref mean? It actually means exactly this, an animal with a mortal wound, an animal which is being torn. Litrof is to like tear apart, yeah? An animal, the classic case of the Torah is an animal was attacked by another animal. Your sheep was attacked by a lynx or something, a cat, and it got very badly wounded, but it's still alive, yeah? And it could still stay alive for a while. But this wound that it's got is going to, long-term, going to cause the death of the animal. Such an animal, even though it's alive and continuing to live, is called already a trefa. It's considered like torn apart, ready to die. And such an animal you're not allowed to eat, even if you do shchita to it. A Jewish shochet does the shchita to this animal correctly, doesn't matter. It does not kasher because the animal is a trefa. And then it became an expression, anything that's not kosher, we will say it's treif. But actually, trefa, treif, in the original meaning means specifically this. Therefore, you should know when, if there's any reason to assume, after they've slaughtered an animal, there's any reason to believe there might be an illness in the animal, a wound somewhere, they will check that before they'll allow it on the kosher market. Usually, we don't assume there is a problem unless there is reason to assume if we've seen the animal fighting, let's say, with another animal. One thing that they always check very well is the lungs. Yeah, with cows, with sheep, because lungs very often get all sorts of perforations, holes, and so on, which could make the animal trefa. So after they slaughter the animal, that's always the first thing they check, and they check the lungs. Again, if you want a bit of terminology, often you hear something being glat kosher. Yeah, what's this thing like glat or chalak in Hebrew? Chalak is Hebrew, glat is Yiddish. Chalak bet Yosef, chalak, glat. What is this all about? So these are just different standards of how smooth the cow's lungs are, right? There are different opinions in the halacha, what constitutes a trefa and what doesn't. And when something is glat kosher or halak bet Yosef, it means that it will follow the higher standard how to define if it's kosher. So some people will be stricter, will eat will not eat the regular kosher. They will only eat if it's glad kosher. But it's a very specific thing, really. It's got to do with the trefot of the cow. I think it's only by cows. Even sheep don't have these different levels. Specific thing by cows, that how smooth the lungs are, and at what point do you say it's a trefa or not? What sorts of covers of bumps in the lungs are acceptable? Which ones are not acceptable? Yeah. We can speak another time, maybe. Very often it gets confusing when you come from the new to this world of kashrut. Why is there talk about standards, and why people say something is kosher and somebody says it's not kosher, somebody says it's glad kosher, and either food is kosher or it's not. So on the basis, you're right, these mitzvot are the mitzvot of the Torah, and they are all the same, and nobody argues on them. What you do find sometimes there is arguments on fine points, like the one I just told you about the lungs. There might be some kosher certificate that have a better reputation for checking things, for example, than others. So that's how you end up with these arguments. And sometimes it just gets, unfortunately, very political. Some people, they trust this rabbi, they don't trust the other rabbi. There are fights, there are arguments, which is if you want, the sad or dirty side of kashrut. But on the basic idea, everybody agrees. What's written in the Torah, what's written in the Talmud, what's written in the Shulchan Aruch. And you have sometimes arguments over fine points, and also perhaps on the level of how much checking, how much supervision is involved. Okay, then we have a very interesting prohibition, not to partake of a limb from a living animal. This is known as ever min achai, a limb from a living animal. This is a very interesting law of kashrut, because actually it's not only for Jews, it's for non-Jews as well. I could imagine most of you are familiar. Are you familiar with the Sheva Mitzvot B'nei Noach, the 7 laws of Noach? Has that been taught to you, discussed?
Yes.
Very good. Excellent. So that is very important, of course, because these are the laws that every person has to keep everywhere in the world. The Sheva Mitzvot B'nei Noach. There's a question here. Yeah. And I know there are some people in this class who are Jewish, some people who are interested in conversion. But this is a law that everybody has to keep, whether Jewish or not to cut off a piece of a living animal and to eat it. It's not very practical. Not so many people do it anyways nowadays, but it's an important thing to be aware of. So obviously it applies to. This is the only side of kashrut that applies to everybody. All the other laws of kashrut are only for Jews. Yeah, non-Jews are allowed to eat non-kosher, and there's no reason really for a non-Jew to keep kosher, right? Sometimes, obviously, those of you who are in a program preparing for Giyur want to convert. They should practice all the halachot of the Torah, so they're ready to keep them. But there's nothing for a regular non-Jew in the street. There's no real reason why they shouldn't eat. Sometimes I get questions that people ask, is kosher healthier or unhealthier? Maybe there are some health benefits, but there are plenty of non-Jews around who eat shrimps and pork, and they're fine. So that's obviously not the main reason why this is forbidden. Okay, but this is the limb from an ever min achai, limb from a living animal, forbidden to everybody. Okay, then we have blood, dam. Prohibition of eating or drinking blood. Now, this is an interesting thing. So Jews, of course, don't drink blood, don't eat blood. Mostly, it's not such a hard thing to do. I don't think many people eat or drink blood anyways. It's written many times in the Torah. I think in some types of cuisine, I think they do use blood, puddings out of it and so on. So obviously that you can't have. But this is not just a question of not eating or drinking blood. There is a very specific procedure how we actually get rid of blood when we do make kosher meat. Has anybody perhaps heard of this before? Does anybody know what we do to kosher meat after the slaughtering? Oh, Rebecca Ketura, please.
It's a salting process.
Very good. So what we do is after the shochet has slaughtered the animal, there's a whole process. We check the trefot, we check, as we explained, we have to cut off certain parts, as we'll see soon. Certain parts of the animal are not allowed to be eaten. But after that, you have to remove the blood. Now, traditionally, not so long ago, even 30, 40 years ago, it was very common in many places that the butcher would get the meat fresh. They would sell it to the customer. The customers would do the salting process at home. Nowadays, thank God, that's not so necessary, as I don't really know of, I don't think there are many places in the world anywhere where they would sell meat like that. They'll do the kashering either at the slaughterhouse or in the factory or in the butcher's shop. They're not going to sell it before they made it kasher. But not so long ago, it was still common that they expected people to do it themselves. So what do you do practically? Again, like I said, it's not so practical for you. You're just going to buy food that's kosher nowadays. But you should know the theory. The theory is you put the meat into a bowl of water for half an hour. Then it's put covered in salt for an hour, and then it's washed completely. This will remove all the blood from the meat, and then the meat is kasher. But as I said, this is done already before, especially here in our countries, in Scandinavia, because we don't even have access to fresh kosher meat. Yeah, we get it frozen, brought from abroad. There's no shchita in any of these countries. So definitely they will have done the melicha before they've frozen the meat, because you're not even allowed to leave the meat without doing the salting for too long. So they'll always do it before they send the frozen package to the shops. Okay, so that's the point of blood. Okay, the next one is actually not such a good translation, the fat of the kosher animal. Of course, you can eat fat, but there's certain fats known as chelev. See, chelev, which is a very specific type of fat of certain areas. I don't remember exactly. I think a lot of them are near the kidneys and by the liver. The liver itself is kosher. There are certain fats nearby, and these fats are known as chelev. And actually, in the times of the temple, when we brought a sacrifice, these were burned on the altar. They were burned on the mizbeach. So we have to remove those fats, the chelev, from a sheep and from a cow. This is one of the jobs, again, that is dealt with the kosher meat. After the slaughtering, they will remove what's called nikul. They remove these fats, remove this chelev. They also have to remove the gid hanasheh. Anybody know what the gid hanasheh is? The sciatic nerve. Ever heard of the story why Jews don't eat this sciatic nerve? Okay, so
Yes.
please tell us.
No, I prefer you to explain, but I guess it's let's see how I can put it in the right words. It's a very, very important procedure so the animal doesn't feel any pain. Is that right?
No. Okay. So no, we're not talking about that. So I'm talking about things that are removed from the animal after the shchita. Okay. So the shchita, let's make clear what shchita is. Maybe, as we explained, shchita is a very specific slaughtering method. You take the shochet is taught all the halachot. It's a very sharp knife, a perfect knife. He checks it before the shchita. In one cut, he cuts the throat of the animal, cuts the food pipe and the windpipe, and the animal dies immediately. and that's the shchita. I thought
Okay,
how-
I understood it as, because if I understood before taking the blood out, there is this nerve that is cut, so the animal doesn't feel,
no.
even meanwhile is alive, it doesn't feel any pain. So I
Yeah.
thought it was part of it or related to
No.
it.
So after the shchita is done, the next thing we do is nikur. Nikur means you remove these things. You remove the fat, that means this chelev, the certain types of fat, which we're not allowed to eat, and remove the gid and asher. The gid and asher, it's told us in the Torah that Yaakov and the angel had a fight. The wrestling between Yaakov and the angel is mentioned in the Torah. In Bereshit, I'll tell you where it is. It's Parashat Vayishlach. So it's the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, chapter 32. Yeah, there you'll find the fight between Yaakov and the angel. And at the end of the evening, he could not defeat Yaakov. The angel could not defeat Yaakov, and he misplaced his this area, this Gid and Asher, a certain type of hit his hip, and he hurt this nerve. And that's why we remove the nerve, we remove a certain part around it. Yeah, so this is all the nikur, and this is done in the slaughterhouse or in the factory or so on. Nowadays, actually, interesting thing, usually what happens in the kosher manufacturing, they don't actually bother to do too much nikur because it's a big job to start removing the fats and removing the gid and asher, and it's a lot of work. So what they often do is, after they've slaughtered the animal, they only put the front part of the animal on the kosher market, and they sell the back part to the non-Jewish market. And saves a lot of time, and there's plenty of good meat in the front of the cow. So that saves a lot of work. But in the past, when it wasn't industrial times and Jews were living in villages, this was one of the big jobs. Was the menaker. He removed the gid and asher, he removed the fats. Yeah. Okay. Cecilia Larson, I see you've raised your hand, please.
Yes, I'm thinking of why take away the fat of a kosher animal? Is that because of you did that in the offering, the korbanot? Yes,
exactly. So as I said, again, this is it's not a good translation. It's not all the fat. Yeah, obviously you're allowed to eat fat in meat. It's very specific fats called chele.
Yeah.
And those were brought up as sacrifices in the temple, and we don't eat them, okay? So in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, was one big part of the sacrifice was burning these chalavim, these specific fats.
Something very bad then.
Yeah. Right. So that's that. Okay. So then you have your ready piece of meat. You've slaughtered it, you've done shchita, you've done nikur, you've removed the gid and asher, you removed the chelev. Then you've done melicha, the salting, you've removed the blood. And now you have your meat that's ready for use. But even then, you have another prohibition. Basar b'chalab. You can't eat a mixture of milk and meat together. You can't eat it, right? This is very interesting. Does anybody know what does the Torah say about meat and milk? It's a famous sentence, and it comes 3 times in the Torah.
Yes. So it says that you cannot cook a kid in its mother's milk.
Excellent. Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo. You shall not cook a kid, you shall not cook a calf in its mother's milk. It's written 3 times in the Torah. And the Chachamim explain us that this is actually a figure of speech. What it really means is that you can't cook a cow or a lamb or any of these animals in milk. Just a practical thing. Often in the olden days, if there was the mother was nearby, they would milk the cow and cook the kid in it. But really, any of these animals cannot be cooked with milk. And because written 3 times, so it means there are 3 teachings. You have to remember the Torah, there's nothing extra. So every word is a message from God. So why is it 3 times? Our oral tradition teaches us there are 3 prohibitions. There's a prohibition not to eat a mixture of meat and milk. There's a prohibition not to cook meat and milk together. Very interesting. Even if you're not planning on eating it. Let's say you're working in a restaurant or something for non-Jews. You're not allowed to cook the meat and milk together. And then the third is interesting. They haven't put it here. Not to take meat to milk, not to cook it. There's also another provision. Maybe it hasn't been put here. There's an isur hana'ah. You're not supposed to have any benefit from it. You can't become a businessman who sells mixtures of meat and milk. So cook together. So that's another interesting point in this. That the other areas of halakha, non-kosher animals or non-kosher meat, you can benefit from it. You can give it to your friends who are not Jewish or something. But this you won't be able to. Meat and milk, you can't derive any benefit from it. Okay. Be'ezrat Hashem, of course, I'm just giving you a run through of the theory. Be'ezrat Hashem, each one will need to be studied in its own right. This lecture today is introduction to Kashrut. So the idea is just to give you an overview of all the different questions that come up in Kashrut, all the different prohibitions, so that when we come to the practice, you'll understand what different issues you have to deal with. Okay. So now this bread from a new grain. Again, this is interesting. It is very practical. We're actually in the right time of the year now. There's something called Chadash and Yashan, new and old. The Jews, of course, as you remember, in the times of the Torah, were farmers. And there was a mitzvah to bring on the second day of Pesach, the Korban HaOmer. They would bring one Omer, one certain type of measurement of flour, of barley flour, because the barley was ready for harvest. And when that sacrifice was brought of barley, then you were allowed to eat from the new grain. That was it was time for that had been harvested already. So, and then they would count the Omer 49, and then the Shavuot they would bring a sacrifice of wheat. That's what we're counting, the time between the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. It's very interesting halacha. Before this sacrifice was brought, you were not allowed to eat. That means to say, at the end of, before Pesach already, they were harvesting the fields, and they harvested the barley, but they were not allowed to eat any of the food they made from this barley until they brought the sacrifice on the second day of Pesach. Until that day, it's called Chadash, new. Once you brought sacrifice, it's Yashan, it's old. Nowadays, we don't have the temple, but that day, the second day of Pesach, is still the defining day. So anything, any grain that has been collected, that has been harvested from the new crop of that year, you can't eat it until the second day of Pesach. And if something is growing after that and wasn't harvested yet, and you try to harvest it later in the year, you won't be able to eat it until the second day of Pesach the following year. That is the concept of Chadash and Yashan. Now, many people, there are certain opinions who say this only applies in Eretz Israel, and many rely on that, and that's why we don't worry too much about it in Chutz La'aretz, in the diaspora. There are many opinions that say it does apply in the diaspora, so you will find sometimes some Kashrut stamps will say, no worry of Chadash, or there is a worry of Chadash. Chadash, Yashan, again, it's something that's a bit hard to keep an eye on always. In these countries, we don't know exactly. Nowadays, it's very different from the olden days because they harvest a lot of grain. They keep them in massive silos. And you would have an expert really to know. Once I even tried to look into this, like what grain they use and the grain that's in the bread today, from what year it is, when did they harvest it, might not even be documented. So, there are opinions that say the diaspora is not a problem. In Eretz Israel, it's definitely, absolutely the halacha, and it's very important. That's why one big part of the kashrut work is to make sure that this is kept. That means that there is no chadash. Anything that's harvested, let's say, that was harvested before Pesach, before the second day of Pesach. This year can go now on the market from the second day of Pesach. Anything is harvested now after the second day of Pesach will only go on the market as kosher after a year later, after the second day of Pesach. That's a concept of Chadash and Yashan. Okay, new grain, roasted grain, fresh new grain. That's all of that. Then there's a prohibition of orla. Yeah, orla means if you have a fruit tree, the first 3 years the Torah says you're not allowed to eat from those fruits. The 4th year we actually would bring it as to the temple, or you would pass its holiness of the fruit onto a coin and bring the coin to the temple and spend the money in Jerusalem. And then for the 5th year you could eat it. So these laws of orla have to be kept. Again, in the diaspora, you don't need to start researching what year fruit this is. In Eretz Israel, it's a very big issue, the study of orla, to make sure everything's orla. Not to partake of produce grown in a vineyard with mixed pieces, the issue of ilayim. You cannot, if you've planted other grains together with the grapes, and they're mixing and they're planting, that would be a prohibition of kilayim, of mixtures, which the Torah prohibits certain mixtures, just like we're not allowed to wear the wool and linen clothes mixed together, that's shatnez. We're also not allowed to have, in a vineyard, different plants growing together with the vines. And if you would, that would make actually those things growing from there forbidden. Evel, very practical halacha of Eretz Israel. In Eretz Israel, from all your produce, you have to take Trumot and Masrot. You have to take certain tithes. First, you take a little piece was meant for the Kohanim, then 10% for the Leviim, then another 10% of the leftovers would go either sometimes to the poor, and other times have to be eaten by yourself in Jerusalem. There are complicated halachot of everything that grows in Eretz Israel. There we don't have a temple, but the law still applies. You have to pass on the holiness to a coin. It's a whole complicated procedure. That's why if you buy fruit and vegetables from Eretz Israel, sorry, somebody's asking a question. Okay, fine. If you buy fruit and vegetables from Eretz Israel, you would have to be careful to actually be mafrish trumot and masrot. It's not just a complicated thing. It's written in the Sidurim what you have to do. You just have to take a piece off, and then you recite the declaration that you're making this thing. Then you take a coin and you pass on the holiness to a coin. There is a way to do it if you buy Israeli produce. And in Eretz Israel, that is actually a big part of the Kashrut. The Kashrut authority will check that all these things are done. This is the reason why, one of the reasons why in Kashrut is a lot more complicated in Eretz Israel than in the diaspora. Yeah, you find very often Israelis, they come out of Israel and they're completely lost. Like, what can I eat? What can I drink? Because in Israel, a religious Jew is not going to touch anything if he doesn't have a kosher stamp on it. And even then, they discuss what stamp is reliable, which stamp is not reliable. But you have to remember that in Israel, there's lots of halachic problems that are not relevant in the diaspora, right? Trumot, Masrot, all these things are special laws that only apply to Eretz Israel. Produce that grows in Sweden or in Germany or in South Africa, these halachot don't apply. So it's less, there's less to check. But of course, it is important to be aware of these halachot. And then the last one, not to drink wine poured as a libation to a false deity. That's the din of yain neseh, wine which was poured down as a sacrifice to idols, idolatry. This might sound extremely not practical today. I mean, who sacrifices wine to idols? But actually, there are certain rabbinic rules that are based on this that are extremely important. Okay, so I'll continue soon. There's a few more things, rabbinic prohibitions, but which also play a very important role in the laws of Kashrut. So I would like to go into those as well. But before that, I want to, there's a lot of information in this last 40 minutes or so. Are there any questions at this point? Is there anything from the Torah's mitzvot which is unclear, or you would like a bit more clarification? Okay. Vivi, Olehuva, please.
Yes, so I wanted to ask about this eating milk, not milk, meat. So if you eat meat, how long you need to wait until you can eat milk products again?
Okay, very good. So this is a question which we'll deal with in the course at the right time, but I can already tell you as a answer, just as a specific answer. After eating meat, the normal accepted custom of most Orthodox Jews is 6 hours. After meat, you wait 6 hours before you have milk. You will sometimes meet Jews from certain places who had different customs. My wife is British, and a lot of the Jews in England come from Germany, and there they had a custom of just waiting 3 hours. I know that the Dutch Jews, some of them keep only 1 hour. But these are very small minority groups. The common Orthodox Jewish accepted practice is 6 hours after meat before you eat milk. Bezrat Hashem, maybe we can speak another time more about the why and where does this all come from.
Okay, thank you.
But Samuel, isn't it the custom in Denmark to only wait 1 hour?
That's very possible. I don't know the custom of Denmark. It's very possible. Maybe we'll have to ask Rav Yair. Okay. Good. But I think that'll come in a later shiur. We'll go deeper into meat and milk. But now you've seen the principle. These are the Torah prohibitions. Now we also have a few rabbinic prohibitions, few takanot chazal. Of course, inside these Torah prohibitions, sometimes you will have this is Doraita, this is a prohibition of Torah, and there's a rabbinic protection around it. But then you have specific laws which the Chachamim instituted for very specific reasons. There are 4 takanot chazal, 4 important rabbinic prohibitions related to food that you should keep in mind and be aware of and know. And I will start maybe just, I'm sure you've encountered rabbinic prohibitions before, and rabbinic enactments before, gzerot and takanot. I always like to remind, because in today's world, there's always like this feeling that it's rabbinic, maybe it's not so important, like who are these rabbis telling me how to live? It's not from God, so why do I have to listen to it? It's very important to understand that we're not talking about rabbinic prohibition, not about me, and we're not talking about Moshe David, and I'm not talking about Chief Rabbi of Israel. We're talking about the Chachamim who sat on the Sanhedrin, who sat in the temple courtyard. There was the Lishkat HaGazit, a special room where the Sanhedrin of 71 was sitting, and in the times of the temple, and they had the authority given by the Torah to interpret the Torah and also to enact laws to protect the Torah. And that's written in the Torah itself already, that you shall do what they teach you, you shall not divert to the left or to the right. This is written in the Parashat Shoftim in the Torah. So that, when we say this is a din de Rabbanan, it's just as binding as the din of the Torah. And someone who breaks willingly a din of the Torah says you shall not go to the left or to the right. So the Torah is prohibiting you from breaking what the Chachamim said. These are the Chachamim who had this authority in the Sanhedrin. So these dinim are absolutely binding on every Jew. Sometimes you will find that the rabbis themselves, when they enacted these rules, they allowed certain leniencies in them because they are the Rabbanan. But that's because they made the law. They could also define the laws, and very often they were less strict on them as on the Torah laws, but they're still forbidden. So I'll start where the laws of the Torah stop. We saw this case of not to drink wine poured as a libation, as in Yain Neser, And as I said, that's not something that most of us are ever going to encounter. Find a cup of wine that somebody had actually poured down as a sacrifice to an idol. But the Chachamim created something called Stam Yenam. Stam Yenam. It means the default wine, their default wine. Means what? The non-Jewish wine by default is not kosher. Why did they make such a strict rule? It seemed like quite a big jump going from wine. The Torah only prohibits wine that they're actually going to pour to as a sacrifice, and we're jumping to an extreme. We don't drink any non-Jewish wine. Where does this come from? So the idea is like this, that first of all, there was a lot of idolatry going on. So there was a danger that maybe they had poured it to us as a sacrifice to a god. I read once that the Greeks, they actually used to always pour like 1-2 drops from the bottle as a sacrifice before they sold the wine. So it was a very common thing. Then there was another thing that the Chachamim saw, that when Jews and non-Jews are drinking wine together, they become very close. And that could lead to intermarriage, and that could, which is a very, very serious avera. And therefore, they forbade any non-Jewish wine. So how does this work? How do we make kosher wine? So kosher wine made in a kosher winery, first of all, as long as they're just grapes, anybody can touch them. From the moment you squeeze the grapes, only Jews are allowed to touch them. So in the winery, the place where they make the wine, the people who squeeze the grapes make it only Jews, and usually only Shomer Shabbat Jews, usually only observant Jews there working. They crush the grapes, they bottle them, they secure the area and lock up the place where the wines are fermented so that no non-Jews get anywhere near. And once they're bottled, they're closed with 2 stamps, with the cork and then a stamp on top of the cork, and then they are. And then anybody can touch them because they're closed. While the bottles are closed, anybody, all the middlemen, all the non-Jews can move it around, take it wherever they need to be taken to be sold. This is the way kosher wine works. Once you open it again, put your corkscrew in, you open the bottle of wine, then again only Jews are allowed to handle this bottle of wine. If a non-Jew takes the wine and pours himself a cup, the whole bottle is not kosher anymore, right? So some of you are Jewish in this course, so this is very practical for you. Some of you are not Jewish yet, so obviously all the wine you're drinking will usually not be kosher, but it doesn't matter because you're practicing, you don't need to keep this law. When you become Jewish, you have to be aware that this is the halacha by wine. Wine, you have to always look for the kosher stamp on the wine. And then on top of that, even if there is a kosher stamp, you will still be careful after you open the bottle that you don't allow non-Jewish people to pour the wine. You should pour it yourself. Make sure it's a Jew who pours the wine. Ideally, a Jew who is himself Shomer Shabbat, because it's a bit of a question also about Jews who are not Shomer Shabbat. Okay, that's why. There's one exception that you often find many wines have mevushal written on them. Mevushal means cooked or boiled. What does that mean? So that means that after they pressed the grapes, to Jewish, to observant Jews in the winery, they boiled up the wine. So the rule is boiled is spoiled, right? Nobody is going to consider it anymore high-class, nice wine. And therefore, the Chachamim said they would never pour this as a sacrifice to their gods, and therefore they never made any prohibition on it. So wines which are labeled as mevushal, anybody is allowed to touch the wine, yeah? So you always have to buy kosher wine with a kosher stamp. Then you have to also check, is it mevushal or not? If it's mevushal, then you can have non-Jewish waiters handling it. You can invite non-Jews, they can take the bottle. If it's not mevushal, you have to be very careful not to allow, once the bottle is open, to let the non-Jew touch the bottle. and you shouldn't even leave it around really. If you're going to leave the house and there are non-Jewish people, it's going to be alone with them. Yeah. One nice thing about grape juice is that all the kosher grape juice are always mevushal, because as part of the process of making grape juice, they cook it. So that makes grape juice always easier. Tell you the truth, a lot of kosher wines are mevushal, but very often the nicer ones, the nice Israeli ones, are not, because they're trying to win competitions of wine. So that's very nice to get good wine, but you have to be careful not to allow the non-Jewish people to handle it if you're planning on drinking the wine yourself. So that's the world of yain stam yenam and yain nesach. Then you have another prohibition of the Chachamim called bishul akum, the cooking of non-Jews, non-Jewish cooking. So the halacha is, even if you have food that's completely kosher, kosher equipment, everything is kosher, if a non-Jew cooks it, it would be forbidden. However, before everybody screams and what am I talking about, there are lots and lots of leniencies where it will be allowed anyways. And Bezrat Hashem, as we get there, we can maybe learn about those leniencies. I'm just telling you this why, because sometimes you have a product that seems extremely simple and everything seems completely okay and all the ingredients are okay. And why is the rabbi saying I can't have it? So you should know that there's a problem of bishul akum, even in a product that's completely kosher, if the cook is not Jewish. The reason for this is, again, the Chachamim say we start eating their food with them together, we become too friendly with them, we start eating their cooking, we will become more chance for intermarriage, and therefore they forbade it. And just to give you an example, for example, here in the kitchens of the community, it's always me, or if I'm not available, somebody else, some Jew goes there in the morning and lights the ovens and the stoves to make it so the fires be turned on by a Jew, because otherwise it would be bishul akum, because they're all non-Jewish, the cooks who work in our community. So that's bishul akum, and we'll learn that a certain case doesn't apply. That only applies if it's a fancier food, not in a simpler food. It doesn't apply to a food that could be eaten raw. So there are cases where it's completely allowed, even if a non-Jew cooks it. But I'm just telling you there is such a concept of bishul akum, bishul goy. So that's it. We have stam yenam, we have bishul akum. Then we have something called pat akum, non-Jewish bread. Again, same reason. They were scared that we might start mixing with the non-Jews and get intermarried. But here's a bit trickier, because bread was always a very, very basic food. Yeah. Traditionally, in the time of the Talmud, for sure, bread was the main food, and everything else was mixed together with the bread. So to tell Jews that you can't have bread from non-Jews would be very, very difficult. Yeah, because how are you meant to manage without bread? Yeah. So there are many leniencies. Some say the whole patakum does not apply and was not accepted by all the communities, but many are lenient in it. And also in a place where there is no Jewish baker and there is no option to get bread, which was from a Jewish baker, it's permitted. Patakum is kasher, no problem at all. Yeah? And that's basically, at least by us, the case in Finland. I don't know, I assume you don't have a non-Jewish baker in the other Nordic countries, maybe you do. So then you get into other questions. If there is an option of a Jewish baker, maybe you have to eat from him. Again, it might depend if it's more expensive, if it's not as tasty, and so on. But again, you should be aware there is such a thing as patakum, especially if you're gonna spend time in a larger community in Israel, in America, in certain parts of England, where Pat Israel, Jewish bread, is available. Then you have to be aware that you cannot just eat patakum, a bread baked by a non-Jew, even if you are completely certain that the process and the baking and the ingredients was all completely kosher. So we've mentioned now stam yenam, patakum, bishul akum. One last thing, finish off a few. Some of the alcoholic beverages. Very good question. Yes, so this halacha is only by wine, what I was talking about, the stam yenam rule. Other alcohols, if it's kosher, if it's kosher, it's kosher. Yeah. So obviously, simple vodkas, a simple beer is kosher. Once there are flavors, you should check the flavors. Some of them might be from non-kosher sources. Sometimes they add some wine in it, but otherwise you're allowed to drink alcohol as long as it's kosher. So Chachamim never made an enactment on that. It's interesting because you could get drunk with non-Jews and friendly with them with other drink alcohols as well. But I think what the Chachamim did is they looked at the prohibition that already existed. The non-Jews used to sacrifice wine to the idols. So therefore, they extended this prohibition of wine to all wine in a way basing themselves on the Torah. They didn't want to create a new law on something. They left from the Torah. That's maybe, but I don't know. It's a good question why the Chachamim didn't forbid all alcohols. But okay, I was about to say a few words about Chalav Hakum before I stop. So the fourth din of Chazal. I mean, there are others as well, but I want to just make these a bit clearer because these are big principles. When we get to the practice, you'll see how they fall into place. There is Chalav Hakum and Gvinat Hakum. They actually go together. The milk of non-Jews, the cheese of non-Jews. The Chachamim said that really, in order for milk to be kosher, there should be a Jew watching the milking process. Yeah. Otherwise, it's a problem because the non-Jews often they mixed other animals' milk into the cow's milk, donkey milk, pig milk, whatever. These milks were very good for to preserve the milk. So that was the prohibition, and there are that's yeah, but. Some people say it doesn't apply, it's not so common nowadays. Some people say, Moshe Feinstein famously said in America, the government anyways protects milk a lot in most Western countries. That's definitely the case. They would never allow it, so they would get caught by the police, they would get into trouble. So many people say that nowadays it's not a problem to buy regular milk from a regular store, just pure milk. Some people are strict, and that's why you often see this whole Chalav Israel culture. Sometimes you have on the milk, they say Chalav Israel, Jewish milk, Chalav Shamur, guarded milk. That's what it means. Some people are strict and will require a Jew to go and supervise the milking. When it comes to cheese, it's interesting. By cheese, hard cheeses are not the same as milk. Hard cheeses, they have another problem. Is that the classic way of making hard cheese is to use rennet from inside the cow, which would basically make the cheese basar bechalav, meat and milk together, which is forbidden, isur deoraita. And therefore, Chachamim forbid all hard cheeses which don't have supervision, that don't have a hashgacha. There's been a discussion of what cheese is considered real cheese and what's hard and what's soft. But normally, cheese requires a hashgacha. Cheese requires a kosher supervision in the making of the cheese for it to be kasher. Okay? So we've gone through the halachot, the mitzvot of the Torah, 28 mitzvot from the Torah, and we mentioned 5 famous gzerot chazal: bishul hakum, chalav hakum, gvinat hakum, stam yenam, stam yenam, chalav hakum, bishul hakum, pat hakum, stam yenam, and gvinat hakum. Yeah. Okay, so I think next week, Bezat Hashem, will go more into the practical of what can you actually buy in a shop. How do you know what I can eat? On what basis and how does it work? And Bezat Hashem move on to the kitchen, how to actually run a kosher kitchen practically. You should all read the chapter about Kashrut in the Steinsaltz book. I'm trying to think if I have the pages, but otherwise I'm sure you can find it yourself. I'll stop the screen sharing. I think I have it here. Rega. Okay, I don't seem to have it right now under me, but you'll find the chapter on Kashrut. If you're not sure, you can ask me during the week and send me an email or whatever. Read on that. And then next week we'll look into practice. How do you shop kosher? How do you buy kosher? And discuss a bit the kosher meat, so discuss the things. Any questions to finish off?
Yes, sorry, I also wrote it in the chat. So for milk to be Chalav Yisrael, it needs to be overlooked by an observant Jewish person. Is that the same for grain products to become Pas Yisrael?
Okay, so Pat Israel is a bit different because there are two different reasons. Chalav Israel, they were worried about a very specific thing. They were worried that they were worried that maybe the non-Jew is going to mix non-kosher milk into the kosher milk. Yeah, kosher milk. Technically, the rule is what comes from a kosher animal is kosher. So cow is kosher, cow's milk is kosher. Donkey is not kosher, donkey milk is not kosher. Camel milk, let's say Arabs they drink camel milk. So they were scared that if there's nobody supervising what the non-Jew is doing, he might mix both milks. Therefore, they enacted that the Jew should go there and supervise when the non-Jews are milking the cow. That is Chalav Israel. Now, Pat Israel is a completely different thing. There, they're not worried that there was anything non-kosher. Yeah, if there's non-kosher, of course, they're not going to eat it. They were worried that even if everything's completely kosher, if we get very friendly with the non-Jews and they give us bread, we give them bread and so on, so it will lead to marriage and intermarriage and so on. So Pat Israel is different. There, it's not the point of checking, it's the point of who is the baker, who is the cook. Because the one who bakes, he makes it into his bread. If a Jew bakes it, then it's Jewish bread. So because bread was such a basic thing, they were very, very lenient. All you need to do is the Jew has to somehow affect the baking process. Yeah, he has to turn on the fire, make the fire stronger. The Talmud tells, for example, sometimes the Jew could just throw a coal in it. Yeah, something that affect the baking process. Yeah, the most practical is you turn on the oven. The Jew turns on the oven, then it will be Pat Israel. Of course, separate from that, you have to check there's nothing non-kosher going on in the bakery. But that's a separate matter. Here, in order for it to be Pat Israel, what you need is that the Jew is involved in the baking process. Okay, there's more raised hands. Please, Yael.
Yes, it's about Bishul Akum. I remember there was a saying something about things you wouldn't serve on a king's table. Like it was an easy way to remember what it was. Wasn't it something like this?
Very good. So I didn't want to go too much detail, but now that you've opened the question, basically it works like this. Food that is fit, that can be served at the king's table, that would be, that Ole al Shulchan Melachim, that's on what the Bishul Akum was enacted. Something which would not be served at the king's table, at a nice banquet, a state dinner, that is not, Bishul Akum does not apply to that. That's why many opinions say, for example, that baked beans are not a problem, because they don't serve baked beans at a nice meal. Yeah. Many people say, potato chips, crisps, they're not a problem, because they're not going to put out crisps at a nice meal, right? So even if it's a non-Jew who's fried them, it's not a problem. There are different opinions how to define it and how strictly do you define it, but this is the general rule. There's another important leniency, that something that could be eaten raw or eaten raw is not a problem, right? So for example, lots of vegetables, you can eat them raw, you can eat them cooked. But since you can eat them raw, and it's a common thing to eat them raw. So then, even though the non-Jew cooks it for you, he hasn't done you such a big favor. So you're allowed to eat it even if he's cooked. Again, provided that everything is kosher, the utensils are kosher, and so. Silke, please.
It was just the milk, because you mentioned that it needed to be needed to have the have the stamp of the kosher and have a rabbi overlook it, but we have a list in Denmark that has like kosher certificate. Like it's not a kosher certificate, but a rabbi has been to the factory. Is it halachically okay then, even if it's?
So as I explained in Chalav Israel, I told you what's written in the Talmud. Now, there are many opinions who allow milk, which, first of all, some opinions say that this prohibition doesn't apply nowadays, because you have to remember what was the classic situation then go 2,000 years back. You have a farmer. The farmer, he's got horses, he's got donkeys, he's got camels, he's got cows, he's got sheep. and he's milking. So he's milking a cow. If he feels donkey milk will be useful, take a bit of donkey milk. That's of course not the situation nowadays. Who's milking donkeys? Yeah, donkeys and cows are not, people, they're not in the same place. It's a big industrial farms. So it could be the whole thing is not so practical. But could be not. Could be that once the Sanhedrin made a decision, you have to follow it. There's another argument. Moshe Feinstein was the great leader of American Jewry in the previous century. He had another argument that even if you say you have to supervise it, but it could be that the supervision of the government is enough. And definitely in America, and I think definitely our countries as well, European countries, they're quite strict. They're not going to allow, they would check quite regularly, and they're not going to allow something like this to happen. Imagine what a scandal would happen if you would buy in your shop milk, and it turns out there was some donkey milk or some pig milk added to it. It would be a huge scandal. They'd probably have to pay a fine. So that's why definitely you can, most opinions say you can allow it, especially if you live in a country like here where there is no Chalav Yisrael available. There is very strong halachic basis to allow buying regular milk from a regular shop. Okay, so should we finish here and continue next week? Read up your chapters, and you're welcome to send me any questions if you want anything to be dealt with during the shiur next week. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Heippa.
Bye.